Good afternoon, everyone. It is with great enthusiasm that we open the academic year of the graduate program in archaeology at MyUSP with today's inaugural lecture, delivered by a very special guest, Professor Justin Leidwanger from Stanford University. Professor Leidwanger is Associate Professor in the Department of Classical at Stanford, with a courtesy appointment in the Torres School of Sustainability, and he is affiliated with several interdisciplinary research centers. He directs a maritime archaeology and digital heritage lab, a research hub dedicated to underwater archaeology, digital modeling, and ceramic analysis, with a strong emphasis on field-based collaboration and museology. His research focuses on Mediterranean mobilities, maritime communities, and systems of exchange through the study of shipwrecks and port sites, especially in southwest Sicily and southwest Turkey. He investigates long-term patterns of connectivity and transformation among communities, navigating the socially, politically, and economically shifting worlds from the rise of Roman through late antiquity. Between 2013 and 2019, Professor Leidwanger led the excavation of the so-called Marzamemi church wreck, a 6th century shipwreck carrying nearly 100 tons of marble architectural elements, likely intended for the construction of a church. Since then, research has continued through underwater surveys, 3D modeling, and public outreach initiatives, including immersive exhibitions and dive trails connected to the Museum of Sea in Marzamemi. Professor Leidwanger is also the author of Roman Seas, a maritime archaeology of Eastern Mediterranean economies, Oxford University Press, and editor of several key volumes in the field, including Maritime Networks in the Ancient Mediterranean World, Cambridge. His current project, Fluid Technology, explores and standardization and efficiency in the Roman maritime economy by analyzing transport amphoras, port infrastructures, and ancient systems of distributions. Today's lecture, titled Marzamemi to Church Wreck, invite us to reflect on the connections between mobility, religiosity, and economy in late antiquity Mediterranean, and how maritime archaeology can contribute to a critical and engaged understanding of the present. In this spirit, we would also like to highlight how this lecture resonates with the diverse areas that make up the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at the University of São Paulo, whether in the study of ancient Mediterranean, Brazilian archaeology, ethnology, of museology, all share a commitment of understanding, preserving, and reimagining heritage through multiple voices and perspectives. Welcome, Professor Justin. It is an honor to have you with us at MyUSP. Please. Yeah.
It's me. Wonderful. Thank you so much. How do I advance the slides? Do you move the slides forward or what? The chair? Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. It's wonderful to be here. I have never been to Brazil before. It's been a wonderful week and a half almost now, and we are having, it's such an amazing opportunity. I got to learn a little bit about Brazil when Marcio was visiting us as a researcher for more than a year, I think, at the Stanford Archaeology Center. And I've been looking forward to an opportunity to be here and to visit in turn. It's really been spectacular. So thank you for arranging that. Thank you for the warm welcome. Those of you who know something about my work know that many times it's about the late antique Mediterranean. It's about the end of the Roman Empire. And I'm sorry that I will speak about late antiquity in English rather than in Portuguese. I will try, even though I get very excited about late antiquity, I will try to slow down and not get too excited and too fast. But I want to speak to you today about a shipwreck that is really quite famous in the world of Mediterranean archaeology. It's one that became known very quickly and very early on as the church wreck. It's one that's so famous, in fact, that it featured in a book from last year about 12 wrecks, a history of the world in 12 shipwrecks. It's chapter 7 or something like this, I think. But it's so well known that it appears in popular books, and it's in books about ancient architecture because of its cargo, as you will see. It's in books about ancient seafaring, ancient economy. It's really one of the better known shipwrecks that we have from the ancient Mediterranean. But I think it's one that it's one that we have not understood very well. It's one that we have not understood in its context, the way we need to understand it, every shipwreck in its particular context. And it's one that has not changed in its interpretation from the very early years of excavation to today. So our project was aimed at really recontextualizing, understanding again in a new way this shipwreck and the materials it carried. And I want to take you to southeast Sicily, off the very southeast point of the island of Sicily, where this shipwreck lies in shallow waters. And it was discovered in the in 1959, 1960, and it was clearly dated to the period of late antiquity, the late Roman Empire, a period that is known for, in popular imagination, and in old scholarship, many generations ago, as a period of decline and fall of Rome, the end of Rome, the tragedy of the end of the classical world. This is how the period had largely been known. And this was our understanding of this period of antiquity, of the end of the ancient world, when this shipwreck was first investigated. So this shipwreck and that early understanding of this period of decline and fall of Rome were really connected. The shipwreck was interpreted as part of this decline and fall, and was meant to symbolize in some ways what our understanding, what the popular understanding, what the scholarly understanding of this period looked like. It was full of barbarians, of raids, of plague, of natural disasters, of division, of a breaking apart of the empire that once unified all of the Mediterranean, a period of poverty, and of course also of the rise of Christianity. It was seen as a very transformative, but a period just largely of decline. One figure and one early Byzantine or late Roman emperor was seen as slightly different from the rest of this. It's a long trajectory of decline. But one emperor, the Emperor Justinian, was seen as an example of one brief moment when the empire did not decline. Very briefly, he reconquered large parts of the Mediterranean, reassembled the different parts of Rome, and recreated, in a way, the Roman Empire in late antiquity, only for maybe 20 or 30 years. But very briefly, he was seen as representing this period, a different trajectory, a rejection of decline. Otherwise, this period was seen as one of decline. And it was in this context that Gerhard Capitan, one of the innovators, one of the pioneers of underwater archaeology, excavated this shipwreck. The shipwreck was discovered in the late 1950s, though we now know that it was actually known much earlier, even in the first decades of the 20th century. But Gerhard Capitan led a series of excavations in the early days of underwater archaeology. when no one knew particularly how to excavate a shipwreck. So he was figuring out this process of excavation of a shipwreck at the same time as other people were experimenting with new methods to excavate a shipwreck in Turkey and in Italy and in France. His excavations, of course, took place in this understanding of the period on which he was working. You can see some of his finds here and some of the early attempts to excavate the shipwreck, still learning the techniques of underwater archaeology. But what he found mostly fragments, but we can find their ceramics, little pieces of small pieces of ceramics. One piece of ceramic that you see here with a figure of a praying, sort of a person in a gesture of prayer, or sometimes seen as Christ. He found metal concretions, little bits of metal fasteners from the ship itself. So very little of the rest of the material, but he did find the cargo, the major cargo, which included many, many tons, tens of tons of architectural materials destined to build an early Christian church. You see some of the materials he excavated here and a reconstruction of what that church may have looked like. So early on in this period of late antiquity, we see large amounts of marble moving around the Mediterranean connected to the religious building programs associated with the early Christian church. And for Gerhard Capitan, and for scholars of this time, there was really only one way to understand a shipwreck like this. If the period was one of decline, of the fall of Rome, of the empire coming apart into little pieces, of poverty, of plague, of strife, of civil wars, how do you understand many tons of marble moving across the Mediterranean? Well, Gerhard Capitan suggested this was connected to the one emperor who did something different, who pushed back on this, who reconnected the Mediterranean, the Emperor Justinian. So the ship and its cargo fit very nicely in that story about late antiquity. It was a one period in which late antiquity was not about decline, about fall. So Capitan suggested this was a shipwreck full of many tons of architectural elements, all of the components you needed to build an early Christian church. He found 27 bases and 28 capitals, and he suggested maybe 28 columns. All the columns are broken. As you can see, they're very broken in the upper left here. But he suggested 28 sets of columns, capitals, bases, and many distinctive interior pieces of the furnishings of an early Christian church. How do you understand this? Who had so much money? Who had the power to move these things? Justinian. Made sense to him. Capitan also suggested it was destined before it was lost. The ship was en route to North Africa to build or rebuild a Christian church in what was then, under Justinian, a newly reconquered province. As Justinian's armies went out and reconnected the Mediterranean and conquered the lost territories of what was the Roman Empire, this was the building wave, a whole series of building programs after that reconquest. So all of it made sense in the old system of thinking about this period of late antiquity. He connected it, of course, to the very specific person of Justinian and this specific period. Well, over the decades that have intervened since then, since the 1960s, we know much more about this period, especially because of the work of Peter Brown, the great the great late antique historian, whose first and probably most important book I put here. Peter Brown depicted or portrayed a period of not decline and fall, not fragmentation and poverty, not civil war and plagues. These were all parts of it, plagues, civil war, but he also presented a period that was full of connections, people moving around, new forms of mobility, pilgrimage, long distance travelers, new ways of spending money, new forms of patronage, new forms of art, new forms of architecture, a vibrant period that represented a change from the ancient world, but one that was full of its own flourishing economy, of its own political connections and of its own social worlds. This has changed fundamentally how we understand this period. And now, instead of talking about this period as one of decline and fall, we think about this period as one of transformation, of change. How did the ancient world change to become the medieval world that we know about? Not just, it wasn't just worse, but it was different. How was it different? It's this rethinking of this period that really led us to reinvestigate this site. If our understanding of this period is totally different from what it was in the 1960s, we need to think about this shipwreck totally differently than we did in the 1960s. We need to think about it in a different context. What does the church wreck look like in the world of Peter Brown's really vibrant, flourishing late antiquity? It also offers an opportunity for us to really understand what drove the economics, the connections across this period during the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. It's one of the last big shipwrecks we have from the ancient world. And those of you who are with us last week will recognize this graph. And I've circled the Marzamemi shipwreck. It's at 100 tons. It's one of the last big shipwrecks we have from late antiquity. And also one of the last marble-carrying shipwrecks that really characterized the Roman world. With Rome, we see the rise of lots of long-distance movement of architecture. What happened to all of these movements? What's driving the continued movements? If we look at this big shipwreck, maybe we can get a better sense of how it fits into a different world, a different thinking about late antiquity. The other reason we excavated this site or went back to this site was because a lot of materials were being lost from the site. Usually we don't think of casual divers or swimmers or fishermen as removing large things from shipwrecks, but capitals, pieces of marble were being illicitly removed, stolen from the site. And some of them you see here that were recovered by the Guardia Costiera, by the Coast Guard, over the course of 2008 to 2010. So because the site really needed reevaluation, and because it was being threatened and looted, we decided to excavate this shipwreck in coordination with the superintendent of the sea, the Superintendenza del Mare, and it became a collaborative project between Stanford and the Superintendenza del Mare, as well as Brock University, and then Suarez de la Benincasa University of Naples, and now Federico II University of Naples in Italy. Our work started in 2013 and continued to 2019 with 7 seasons of excavation. And I want to give you a general sense of what we found and how that compares with what Gerhard Capitan found. And Capitan excavated what was really very obvious and visible on the seabed: large capitals, columns, these sorts of things, pieces with Christian iconography on them, large sculpted crosses on panels, decorative panels. He focused on the middle of the site in a sandy area at about 8 meters deep. Much of the area around that sandy area was also full of cargo materials, but was covered by a reef. The reef had fallen on top of it and buried many parts of the cargo. So our job was both to re-excavate the center of the site and work our way outward to understand and recover the rest of the cargo so that we had a more complete picture of the site. I give you a sense of how the site works. It was a difficult excavation. That's why it took 7 years. But you can see there are parts, small pieces of architecture that are buried in the sand, in sediment, in the silt, and the rocks. Underneath, large pieces of the reef. Some of the pieces of reef on top that fell on top of the site because of the shallow nature of the site. It's only between 4 and 8 meters deep. So the waves move around the rock and they fell on top of it. And some of these pieces that buried the site are 10 to 15 tons in weight. So removing these pieces was a large logistical challenge. But you can see on the lower right what you find in between and underneath the reef and rock: additional pieces of architecture, additional columns, capitals, bases, well-preserved decorative pieces of the furnishings, the parts of the interior of a church that I'll show you in a moment. Here it gives you a sense of this as well. We also found parts of the site that were associated more with ceramics, material from the ship itself, many nails from the ship. In the shallow water here, none of the ship survives. No wood survives. But many of the nails, the metal nails, we could recover. Hundreds of these concretions. Many of the ceramics we could recover. Not just one or two plates that Gerhard Capitan saw, but dozens of amphoras and other wares, cooking pots, dining wares associated with the crew that was on board this ship, and possibly also passengers, if we could. You see here the work of moving these materials, of transporting them is a lot, and we were happy to work with professional divers, technical divers who were able to help support this work and help us move and reposition all of the materials so we could do this safely and excavate the parts that were not accessible before our work. Everything is heavier when it's out of the water. Things are lighter in the water than they are out of the water. So the logistics of handling these things, of working with columns, capitals, and bases, of conserving these materials, everything required specially built tanks to keep the material wet so we could wash them and remove all the salt from 100 tons of columns, capitals, and bases. So you can see this process underway, moving these things around, trying to build tanks, trying to ensure their conservation. We're mostly done with the conservation now. There are a few things remaining, but we hope to finish this, I'm hoping, in over the course of this year. One of the other challenges of this site is because of the dynamic seabed here, because of the wave action, the currents, the wind, the waves, and the tectonics of the seabed. This area sees a lot of earthquakes too. The seabed is changing, and in the shallows, material is being moved over and over again. So we had to come up with a way of recording the material in 3 dimensions that was extremely precise and allowed us to reconstruct the environmental processes that resulted in the very particular form of the site that we saw. Why did a large piece of reef fall on top of this? Were the columns from a shipwreck up on top of the reef? In many instances, I think they were on top. They fell into the area below the reef, and then the reef fell on top of it. So we have many different processes happening. So we had to come up with a complete 3-dimensional documentation of the seabed and of every object on it so that we could reconstruct and reverse these processes to understand how it is that this shipwreck came to rest here and why each individual object was where we found it. We do this for individual small objects. We do this across the entire site at a high precision of with an error of less than only a few millimeters over the entire site. But what do we find? Well, much of what we found was the same as Gerhard Capitan. Marble, everywhere marble. 100 tons of architecture, of columns, capitals, and bases, but also other forms of architectural elements that become clearer for us as well. Because we removed the reef and we spent time understanding and finding things that the Capitan could not find because they were buried, we have many more columns, many more capitals, many more bases. I'm not sure we have the same number of capitals and bases. We don't know how many columns we have because they're all broken. We're trying to reassemble and understand. But we cannot be sure that we have sets of columns, capitals, and bases. We don't necessarily have the same number. We have 35 capitals. We have maybe 32 or maybe 33 bases. Some of these may have been removed, stolen from the site. We don't know. But we don't know that the number is the exact same for every object. So maybe these aren't sets in that way. But whatever it is, there are many, many, many more capitals than you can fit inside a church. of the size that would use this size of capital or column. There are too many. You simply cannot fit them. So we're looking at something more than just one church. We also know now that these materials are almost certainly dated to before Justinian. They're probably from 500, 510, 520, maybe the 520s up to 530. These very likely were sculpted before Justinian. So they don't have to be connected to Justinian as the patron, the builder of a church. So small changes in the date make it possible to think about other histories around this wreck. We know that these materials all come, the capitals, columns, and bases all come from Proconnesus, the major quarry that supplied Constantinople, the imperial center. We know that they're exported at maybe two different stages of completion, one slightly more complete, one slightly less complete. Many of them have quarry marks on them with Greek letters, suggesting a connection to maybe one crew, one group of workers. We don't know what they mean. Here you see a few letters from one of the capitals. We do know that they all come from Proconnesus, though. All of this material was being quarried near Constantinople and probably sculpted in the marble workshops of the imperial capital in Constantinople. It makes a lot of sense. This is where we see a lot of concentration of workers, of skilled craftsmen in this period, right both in the marble yards themselves on Marmara, on Proconnesus, and in the imperial capital. This material was easy to access. It was on an island. It was close to shore, so it was easy to quarry this sort of marble. But it was also a marble that was very meaningful and symbolic. One of my former colleagues, Fabio Berri, wrote a beautiful article about the particular aesthetic qualities of this marble. When polished, and here you see the floor of Hagia Sophia, of Holy Wisdom Church, one of Justinian's projects. And the polished floor of it, you can see the gray streaks in this look like ripples of water. They look like waves. And our descriptions of the marble in this church suggest that people are walking across the sea, walking on water. So it's a type of marble that has a very particular kind of symbolic importance associated with it. So perhaps there's also something in this kind of marble. The other materials we found include other pieces of the interior decorative parts of a church, the ambo, or the pulpit. In a verde antico, a breccia, kind of mottled green and white, and darker and lighter green and white stone from the north of Greece, from Thessaly. It was quarried from up in the mountains and dragged overland 100 kilometers to the port for export. This piece was the material here is extraordinarily difficult to get. It's extraordinarily expensive in the ancient accounts, but it was used as a symbolic focal point for the center of the church because of its importance, because of the importance associated with this piece of architecture. So we have most of the pieces of this ambo, but only one of these, obviously. We have other pieces, though, that may be associated with a chancel screen. This is the piece of architecture that separates the church, the congregation, from the clergy. And you see in the reconstruction here, I've highlighted where this is. There are panels sculpted with Christian iconography on both sides and standing pier colonnettes that are 2.2 meters high. So large, elaborately sculpted pieces that would have been fitted together to create this partition within the church. This material also came from Proconnesus. So we have a lot of material from the Sea of Marmara, from near Constantinople, and other material from the northern inland Greece. These, you see, are the two major sources we have. Now, this assembly of many different forms of marble, different colors of marble, and their symbolic importance in different ways is is a common story in late antiquity. It's common for Romans too, early on, to take pieces of marble that have different symbolic importance and represent the different geographies in different parts of the empire and collect them into one place. This is done by Roman emperors. It's done by Byzantine emperors as well. So there's a particular symbolic importance associated with them, but collecting them all together becomes an expression of power, an expression of a geography of empire. Now, so we have the same materials as Gerhard Capitan, but many more of them through this new excavation. Too many columns, capitals, and bases for one church, for the interior of one church. Perhaps we're looking at a second building program, another part of the same religious building complex, the outside of the church, a narthex, another part of a religious building program associated with some town, which we'll get to in a second. Maybe we're looking at an entirely different building program. The columns, capitals, and bases can be used for any sort of building program. We see these in markets and in fora. We see them not just in religious contexts, but in civic contexts. So maybe we're looking at not just a church, but other parts, other architectural pieces moving together, several building commissions, several parts of building programs moving together across the Mediterranean. Now, in its early understanding, this shipwreck from Capitan was seen as representing just one church and all of the pieces you would need to build the inside of a church. It was sort of a kit, right? A church in a box, right? It's all of the pieces you need to build a church. And Justinian is sending this out to the end of the empire in his newly reconquered provinces to rebuild all of these churches, to impose a particular form of church building and possibly a particular form of Christianity on it. We know now that one form of church does not generate one form of Christian worship. Different sects of Christianity share architectural spaces. They have many of the same conventions, many architecturally at least, even if they're expressing their Christianity in different ways. So it doesn't make sense to think about this as imposing a certain type of religious practice. And in fact, we see many of the Christian bishops, many of the Ostrogothic and Visigothic and Vandal rulers and aristocrats ordering material and bringing it from the empire, from the Byzantine Empire to their own territories before Justinian's own conquest. We also see that this is mixing perhaps a couple different building programs, not just one church in a box, right? But this idea about kind of a church, this IKEA style, everything you need for one church, is a very strong model, right? It continues. People like it. And when our material the material from this excavation went on exhibit, and it went to Oxford, and then to Amsterdam, and to Bonn in Germany, and then to Palermo. We had to come up with, the curators created a story around it as part of an exhibit called Sicily and the Sea. And you see some of the materials here with it. And when we were talking about how it is that we understand this shipwreck, we talked about it, we described the sort of IKEA model, the church in a box. In English, we think about it as a flat pack church. All the pieces flattened down, pack into a box, and you ship it out. And this idea of a flat pack church is a very powerful one. That's right. The press, the BBC picked up on this idea of a flat pack church. It's Justinian's shipment of churches all across his empire. So the BBC picked up on it. Next one. We're on to the second PowerPoint now. Are we good? Thank you very much. All right. Other news outlets picked up on this with very kind of silly titles about, Byzantine emperor was king of the flat packs, and this one says centuries before the Swedes. So they're all talking about this model, the IKEA style model, right? But we know this can't be the case. We have a couple different building programs going together. We don't have potentially even all the components of the interior of one church. We have something much messier than any of this. It doesn't work. It doesn't work like an IKEA style. But the question is, how can we actually understand whether we have one set, two sets, whether all of this material was meant for one kind of building program or not? Well, in order to do this, we undertook 3D scanning of all of the materials, of the hundreds of materials, fragments, parts of columns. Anything bigger than basically this has been 3D scanned. So we can reconstruct them. We can bring all of the columns back together and test how many columns we have. So we have 3D scans we have like 15 terabytes of data of 3D scans of all of these architectural materials, so we can reconstruct them in a database linked to material, linked to part of the site. This allows us to put all of the fragments into place to understand. And in fact, we see that we have quite a bit of variation with these panels from the chancel screen. Some are this thin, some are nearly 50% thicker. They range quite a bit. And it's not unusual in one church complex to range a little bit, but there's quite a bit of variation in the decoration, in the thickness, in some of the linear dimensions of some of the decorative elements. They're not highly standardized. The other thing this scanning program allows us to do is to bring together our material excavated, the material excavated in the last 10 years, 15 years, with all of the material excavated by Gerhard Capitan. That material is in Syracuse, is in part of the archaeological park of Neapolis in Syracuse. And so in order to reassemble the cargo, we have to do it digitally. The two pieces, half of a column excavated by Capitan goes with half of a column from our excavations. It's the only way to reconstruct this, is to work digitally. One of the other attempts we've made to understand the seabed and the cargo and the histories of these objects has to do with the marine biological remains that have grown on these columns and capitals. You see these are all covered in many instances. They're covered on many sides with concretion. These are shells of marine organisms that have bored into the material, eaten into it, but also built on top of it. And understanding the different types of marine creatures that are on the surface of these allows us to understand which side of the column was up and whether it moved. And in many instances, we can see that things were in shallow water and then turned over and were in 4 meters of water, and then we're in 8 meters of water on their other side. So we know that they moved. And we can start to understand the benthic history, the history of marine biology of these objects, helps us understand the history of the site formation processes that created this wreck. So that in turn allows us to reconstruct this sort of process. Another way we've attempted to understand the history of these objects and what they meant was this an expensive cargo? Is it the kind of thing that only Justinian can afford? The answer is no. It's not. It's big, but it's not that special. And one way we wanted to understand this is how long did it take to create these? So we worked with two professional marble carvers to replicate some materials from this at a smaller scale and to test how many hours it took with professionals, not with me. I'm very bad at this. But the two professionals you see in the middle measured the amount of time that it took to create a smaller scaled version and all the different parts of this, all the different processes that needed to unfold for a capital, for a column, for a base. So we could quantify how much labor, how many people were involved from there. This we compare with historic building manuals. This is now a classic system in Mediterranean archaeology and in archaeology in general of energetics, an analysis of the amount of labor invested in something. We almost always use for stone architecture, Giovanni Pegoretti, a 19th century expert in stone architecture. Other manuals copied him, but Pegoretti gives us how long it takes to carve, to create the rough shape for a capital, how much to create each volume, each little leaf, how much to polish everything. So it goes through all of these stages. We can compare those with what our own carvers experienced and the different stages of work on our materials. This gives us a whole table of numbers. These numbers are not important. You don't have to remember any of these. But the one thing I want to show you is that some things are very difficult to do and are more complete and required much more time than other pieces in the cargo. The other number, one of the things I want to show you here is that the entire work required probably only about 50,000 hours. That's a lot, but it's not that bad. It's 24 workers, 18 months. It's not that much labor. So 20, 25 workers, 16, 18 months. It's nothing on the scale of an Hagia Sophia. This is small. This was within the budget of any local bishop, right, who had this amount of time. Now, if the ship was lost, it would have taken probably another 2 years to replace all of this material. So one wonders, was the project ever completed or was it abandoned? We don't know, but we can get a sense of just about how expensive this is. Interestingly, almost all of the work that was required to use these materials is done. So we can compare how much of the work to finish a capital, a base, all of these materials, how much was done already before it was shipped, and how much still had to happen when it reached its destination. These could have been completed by a dozen craftsmen in a month. And installed. That's it. Now, you could do a lot more. You could polish every column, but you don't have to. And in late antiquity, we see one column will be polished, the next one, not so much. The ones in the front will be polished, the ones behind them will not. They don't always finish everything. Finished does not mean one thing, right? So these were almost ready to be used. All they had to do was trim them a little bit and put them together. They were ready to go. You also get a sense of where the spending was. Where was the labor most invested? The columns, capitals, and bases are nearly 3/4 of the total expense associated with this project. But the ambo, even though it's very small, it's only a few tons of material compared to 100 tons of capitals and bases. It's very expensive. It's a lot for just a few tons of material. So it starts to give us a sense of where the investment was, how much more work had to be done, what was good enough, who could afford it, these sorts of materials. But we end up with a shipwreck that includes many more columns, many more bases than you can fit inside one church of this size. In order to understand the cargo, we need to understand what else is on board the ship, right? What is moving alongside it? Who is transporting it? Who are the sailors? Who's going with it? How big is this vessel? And this is where I think our excavations helped reveal quite a bit. Gerhard Capitan never produced a final excavation report, so we don't know how many other things he saw and knew but didn't write. We have his notes. Sometimes they mention other materials, but there are many materials that we found that he does not mention, so we know we found things that he didn't find. Some of the material we find are pigments, orpiment, realgar. These are red and gold pigments used for painting in late antique churches. We don't have a huge amount. We have a basket full of it. And just enough to think that it's probably a pigment, not for another purpose, but not enough to finish the project. We have raw brown glass from Egypt. This is primary production glass from Egypt, and I'm grateful to Ian Freestone for doing the analysis. What was this intended to do? We don't know. Maybe it was intended to create lamps of some sort. We know that glass lamps are becoming common in churches at this period of time. We don't know. Maybe it was for little bits of inlay for decorative mosaics or small decorative patterns. And my two favorite pieces from the shipwreck are these little bits at the lower right. These are pieces of opus sectile, that type of late Roman mosaic. In late antiquity, those of you who know mosaics, we go from having mosaics made of small squares, tesserae, to having larger pieces of mosaic in elaborately sculpted patterns that you can use to make very detailed scenes. These are extras. They're polished on one side. They were never used. We have no evidence that they were placed in. They're probably just two extra pieces of opus sectile that do the same thing as any sort of marble sample you see now. If you're renovating your kitchen and you're changing your countertops, you might take a few pieces of marble to trim, right, to see what it looks like in your kitchen. These are samples. These are countertop samples. But for potentially revetment, for covering the walls of a church, for the flooring, something like this, we have in this very small pieces, but possible hints of future journeys, future decorative choices, not just all the pieces of one church, but we have a couple different parts of architectural projects at play and samples and materials that hint at future journeys, next stages of craftsmanship, the next ship that has to deliver the rest of the material. We have not much of the ship itself. And what we have are just some nails, but we have lots of nails. And we have little pieces of lead sheathing that were placed on the outside of the hull. Probably whenever an ancient ship starts to get eaten away by worms and they're trying to save it, they cover it in patches of lead to keep out the marine worms. So we're looking at a ship that's old, that's seen a long life. The nails themselves, just these humble nails, can be cast to evaluate, to figure out how long they are, how big they are. And we see certain sets of nails that give us a sense of how big the timbers of the ship were, because they tend to break at certain points. And we can use those points at which they break to understand how big the different timbers, the different pieces of the ship were. It's a small boat. These are small timbers. This was a heavy load for a small and old boat. Obviously, maybe this is why it was lost, but it's a small vessel, not very lightly built, and probably at the end of a very long line. We have bits of ceramic that give us a sense of the crew. We have water jars to store water to give us a sense of the size of the crew. Probably for a vessel of 30 meters or so, that is the size of this ship, it has to be about 30 meters long to carry 100 tons. You might need 8, 10, 12 crew to go over a long distance. The water jars held enough water for a few days, 3 days. So they were stopping every few days to refill the water jars. They were bringing on board, we think, individual mariners, sailors were bringing on board their own plate to eat. The food was going to be cooked communally, together, as a community. But each individual sailor seems to have brought their own plate. We have plates from all around the Eastern Mediterranean that are slightly different and slightly from all over, from sort of every port of call in the East and Central Mediterranean. But we have sort of transport amphoras, storage jars, that are many more than can just be food for the crew to eat. When we find a few amphoras on board a shipwreck, we usually think it's supplies for the ship. We have 75 or 100 amphoras. We have a small cargo of almost certainly olive oil, not wine. And petrographically, we can link this fabric to the southern Argolid, to the area circled there on the left in mainland Greece. These jars were probably picked up when they stopped to refill water. They picked up 2 tons of amphoras to buy and sell, to create a little extra profit. So we have not just a high-end, an elaborate architectural movement, an architectural shipment, but we also have a commercial cargo, everyday goods, olive oil, wine, moving alongside it. So it's a very messy map of the ship and its cargo. It looks like this, and this is simplified. It's more complicated than this now. We have material from all over the Eastern Mediterranean and the Central Mediterranean, suggesting this was the general orbit and the general realm the ship moved over many lives, over many journeys, not just this final one. So where was this final journey? We don't know. It's Gerhard Capitan had suggested North Africa. And by North Africa, and he said, North Africa is most likely because of the political situation at the time. And it's not 100% clear to me what he means by that, but probably he means that North Africa was the first part to be reconquered by Justinian, and so it's the most likely to have been rebuilt quickly. But he compares these materials to another church that was built in Apollonia, in what's today Eastern Libya. But this doesn't, that sort of part of the map that, one possibility is that the ship wrecked here, but was it heading here, actually? Was it heading here? He raises these two possibilities, but I cannot prove it wrong. One thing I can say is that the ambo, that pulpit in the middle of the church, is very unusual in North Africa. We have two of them. They're both reused. They weren't new. So it doesn't fit perfectly well in North Africa. Italy is where it fits much better. North Africa is Gerhard Capitan's suggestion. In fact, the material looks a lot like San Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna. The columns, the capitals, the bases are the exact same size. They're precisely the same size. These are, in late antiquity, one of our team members, Alison Kidd, who's a curator at the British Museum now, has been studying standard production of columns. And ours are the exact same size. The capitals are the exact same size, and the bases are the exact same size as the San Apollinare Nuovo. So something like this is the size of the church that was probably intended. Now, there are only 24 columns on the inside of the church. So where are the rest? But I suspect that this, probably our ship was heading somewhere in northern Italy, maybe the Adriatic region, maybe what's today Croatia, Slovenia, somewhere like this, or northern Italy. So we end up with a very different picture of this shipwreck after further excavations. We certainly have a church, the remains of a church interior, but we have too many pieces to be one church, suggesting another building program, another part of a church complex, the outside of a church, a courtyard outside, and a narthex, something like this, another building entirely, maybe not religious. We have something that's probably not Justinian, but probably earlier than Justinian. That means that we don't have to connect it to Justinian's reconquest. We can connect it to every other Vandal, Visigoth, Ostrogothic king and queen who we know are building large-scale building programs. This is the kind of material that they're trading in, suggesting that there are many people, many other people, local bishops who we don't know, we don't have their names, could be involved in this, could achieve this scale, could procure these sorts of materials. They were within the realm of possibility for any sort of bishop of a decent-sized city. We have not just one journey, but past journeys on this shipwreck that collected all of these sailors, collected all of their onboard, their ceramics and the like. We have future journeys, hints of future journeys with the glass, the samples and the like. So we can start to see this as not just one shipwreck, not just one box sent by Justinian, but rather something that is more indicative of what we now understand as part of late antiquity. Ongoing connections, elites connecting with elites across political boundaries. Amalasuntha, one of the great Ostrogothic queens, writes to Anastasius, sorry, not Justinian, writes to Anastasius, and asks for marble. Feedback.
I'll put the presentation back.
Okay, no problem.
So,
Password. There we go. Perfect. Great. That's it. So we see both luxury materials like architecture moving and also everyday goods and the connections between these two. One depends on the other. The elites moving things paid for this ship to go. And that allowed olive oil to continue moving. But those same merchants and mariners who are transporting this probably on their last journey across the Mediterranean carried everyday goods. So we see the connections between the everyday and the luxury as well. The last thing I wanted to mention very briefly was how we've gone about trying to represent this the finds from this shipwreck and engage with the different audiences about a new narrative and with these materials, how we've used them to create a sort of exhibit and educational programming. And we're very fortunate to work in a restored winery, a 19th century winery in Sicily that became our conservation lab, our storage space. And one of the reasons we went to this town is that we were charged with creating a new museum of the sea in this space. And it's a wonderful space. It's enormous. It's shaped like a church, like a basilica, which is weird for us, but to put a church inside the church. But this space, of course, will take many years to develop. We've created a 3D model of the whole thing, of the interior and exterior, with laser scanning and drone-based photogrammetry and the like, so we can develop and understand the sound, the space, the light. There are underground passages, storage ways, which we can use to immerse people in kind of an underwater environment in these underground spaces that were used for storage of wine in the last few centuries. There are many options to engage people in this space, but this takes a long time. One of the other initiatives that we've been working with is with the Soprintendenza del Mare to create a dive trail of important shipwrecks along this part of Sicily. There is one already there. Now, we of course have excavated one of the shipwrecks. So how can we can use the 3D model and the 3D replicas of all the objects to create replicas to reconstruct the site as a center of dive tourism. So we can create sort of a museum on the seabed and a museum in this space. But these things take a long time. And we wanted to create something much faster, more immediate. And so in 2018, we started creating a series of pop-up exhibits in the town square, in the piazza of Marzamemi, in the piazza of Portopalo, in the nearby town, in Pachino, with sounds, immersive sound, imagery, light that would go on in the evening and stay on late at night, past midnight. I don't stay up that late, but it stayed on until 2:00 in the morning in the middle of the piazza, giving people a chance after dinner to walk through and learn a little bit about the shipwreck, to hear the sounds associated with marble quarrying, the sounds of excavation underwater, of breathing, of these sorts of things, an app that went with it. So we've tried to create programming that took this shipwreck off the seabed and out of a museum and placed it into the public space. We've done this as part of a trail of several different pop-up exhibits of different shipwrecks and different forms of movement across the Mediterranean. So this is kind of one of our ongoing projects, is to create these sort of immersive moving exhibits around Southeast Sicily. We can also bring people to, he's not here now and he's paying no attention, we've tried to create an app with a heritage trail that allowed people to move from to understand different parts of the archaeological landscape in this part of Sicily, to engage people through kind of an app that would allow them to trace their steps, a story map based. Anyway, these are just some of the things that we've tried to do, and I'll leave it there and just say that there are, any of you who are archaeologists know that there are many, 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 many people in institutions who contribute to a project, and we're blessed to have so many who are dedicated and incredibly productive and collaborative. So I'm thankful to them, and I'm thankful for you, to you all, for giving me the chance to share some of this with you.
Yeah. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. I think we have time for questions. Okay, so Mateo, in the staff, in the beginning, and anything for lecture. Just a second, what was it by YouTube?
YouTube? Yeah, you're gonna have to say it a little louder or a little clear.
We've put you on the spot now. It's okay here. Okay.
So,
They want you to be visible. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah,
There you are. Now you're inescapable.
okay. Thanks for your lecture. You talked shortly about the 3D scanning
Mhm.
of the text collection, but could you talk a little more about the methods and equipment you use it for the 3D modeling in situ of the shipwreck?
I can. We laser scanning. These things don't work underwater. We rely on photogrammetry, and many people here will have experience with photogrammetry. They're widely available sources, and we still use photogrammetry even for objects as well, to complement the 3D scanning, the structured light scanning, and the laser scanning. But on the seabed here, we used a system that was developed by the University of Naples, and it uses stereo photogrammetry, so multiple cameras that are affixed and timed together and capture video. We pull stills from those, and because we have multiple vantage points from two different cameras at the same time at a known point, we can do much better than individual camera photogrammetry. So that system allows us. It's very processing intensive, but it's a little finicky. It's a little difficult, but it allows us to, with multiple cameras, to get at much faster or much better resolution. So over an area of a excavation unit of 4 by 4 meters, we can get millimetric accuracy, which is stupid. No one needs millimetric accuracy because the sand was more than that. But we can if we want. And over the course of the site, you can get to several millimeters to a centimeter. We published this. I'm happy to send you the article with the methodology and the set of things. We published an archaeological perspection a few years ago with my colleagues and Leopoldo Repola.
Make the models available, I think.
The models, we haven't put them on the internet just yet. We put them in the app, so you can play around. You could enter one of the as part of one of the pop-up exhibits. You could reconstruct the site anywhere you wanted. So we could turn this room into the site. I turned a bar into the site one time, and so it's strange. You have all these furniture, and then you have the seabed and all of these objects, and you can go and you can explore the different objects. It's difficult as on an app, though. It was very difficult to maintain it because, one, apps require a lot of maintenance, and two, it was very heavy. Right. So we're trying to experiment with a way that will give you the right resolution in there. But we're planning both an individual, a traditional publication board, but then also a massive amount of online data that you can download and play with. Some people want all of the digital models of every capital. They're there. They will be there. So right now it's just on a server in my lab that we have access to, and the Napolitani have access to, and the like. But we haven't made it fully available online. So, but I'm happy to share some of it if you're interested in exploring. Absolutely. Yeah, we'll send, if you want to look through it and you want to swim over our site, we're happy to have you. So, yes, that's it.
Thank you, Mateo. Were the GCP shipwrecks from later centuries that different from
What we have, the method of construction is a little bit different. It changes to we don't know how this one was constructed entirely, but given the fasteners, we have a decent idea. Their construction is different. They're smaller though. Generally speaking, we see 20, 50 tons. That's about it, not 100 tons. Until you get to the late medieval period, when we start getting things that go to 100, 200 tons again. So different, not in terms of size, definitely. In terms of scale, geography they represent, they tend to be smaller. They tend to have shorter ranges and really kind of, they only have, what we have evidence for are agricultural goods moving, amphoras. That's what we have, millstones. We don't have high-end architectural elements being moved. We have a lot of glass wrecks as well. Raw materials and recycled glass, millstones, and amphoras. So it's not unique. There is another church wreck, actually. There's another one that is late antique and looks like this. Lucy Blue told me about this in Montenegro, I think it is, but it's not been explored. But it's a very particular period that produces this form of shipping. You were born, okay.
What questions, comments?
Comments are good too. The church wreck, yes. We're done with the church wreck. We made an ill-fated attempt to find the anchors last year. I'm frustrated that we have no anchors. We should have anchors. Unless the ship deployed them in deeper water and lost them and continued to drift. But they should be big. They could have been taken by divers, but they're big concretions. These are big, weird metal concretions. People don't steal iron anchor concretions. It's just not a thing. So I'm bothered by a few things that are missing, and I can't explain them. But I think I don't think we've missed much of anything. Yeah. I mean, a few shirts maybe, but not much. So it's a huge amount of effort and logistics to train. I mean, we had working in the water at the height of the season, at our busiest campaign, we had almost 30 people working in the water in 2 different shifts, 15 and 15. 15 people would do 2 dives, double dives, and then 15 others would come and do 2 double dives, and it went from 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. It was a huge amount of logistics to work. So I think we're done with this. So we've moved on to work in a different port to the north of it. But if I missed anything, I will feel very bad. Sure. So I finance it. What are you interested in paying? Sure. No, we've benefited from a variety of both private foundations as well as government funding. Funding that my U.S. government may not do again, but we had funding from the Archaeological Institute of America to get the project started, a startup grant from the Loeb Classical Library Foundation, and then from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And thankfully, because of our partners, we also had funding from the Canadian government, from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Canada Foundation for Innovation, the Ontario Ministry of Innovation, I'm sure I'm forgetting names, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and then, of course, our own institutions helped finance it. So my institution, Stanford, for example, paid for our students to come and participate, and paid for their travel and all the expenses associated with them. So we were able to scale up our crew. And I've been fortunate that the Stanford Archaeology Center has supported the work as well, very much so. For many of the analyses, these were done for free through collaborations with colleagues for the isotopes, stable isotopes, for the petrography. So it is not cheap, but it is. But it is. We put it together from many different sources, and we've had many concessions and many freebies along the way. So that's hence the very long thanks that I'm sure I will have forgotten. Mhm.
Now, about the permission, it's easy to understand. Complicated.
And in Sicily, Sicily is independent, is autonomous. So our permits come from Palermo, not from Rome. That makes it easier in some ways. It's because it's a smaller community. You get to know people more. The Soprintendenza del Mare has a purview for the entire coastline of Sicily. And we were invited there by Sebastiano Tusa to work. Liz and I were invited to create a partnership and to develop a project together to create this museum and to work. So it was really the superintendent of the sea who invited us to come, and so we've benefited immensely from that collaboration. And we continually renew the permit. Then we added more partners to it to develop our Napolitan colleagues to develop the museum. They're doing a lot of museum-based work now, and the like. So it's sort of grown and grown and grown, and we see. I think we'll continue to have permission. I don't think there's a permission with it. Yes, prego. You may.
I think because easier gain permission from by superintendents of the project because the city don't particularly private project was right.
Yeah, there's no private ownership of land of it, right?
If you want to dig in a private property, the state, the rate, actually the rate and the region and Sicily have to pay to the owners because of the damage of the land.
The use of the land as well.
Yes, in the sea.
No.
It's easier to have permission. Well, I think I never worked with superintendents of the fire, but I am archaeologist of Sicily.
Sure.
I know how difficult it is to the permission.
Sure. It is. There are some things that are more difficult at the same time. I mean, this is not because of an administrative challenge, but conservation is enormously complicated, enormously problematic. Storage. The Soprintendenza del Mare does not have the same storage capacity because, so where do you keep things? Do you keep them locally? The Soprintendenza is based in Palermo. So what goes to Palermo? What stays here? How do you administer that? We have wonderful colleagues to work with in Soprintendenza, but it's all of these things you need. If you're going to excavate, it's a huge logistical complication that excavations on land are just simpler, I think, because you create everything up and it goes locally. The conservation is much more of a challenge, year-round conservation, not just packaging in a box and putting it away. Right. So some things absolutely permission. You're not disturbing landowners. There is not this challenge, but other aspects of the project become more complicated. So, yeah, you have many authorities over the sea as well. I mean, the Capitaneria di Porto, the Guardia di Costiera, Guardia di Finanza, Carabinieri. All of these have some authority over different parts of the seabed and activities that take place within it. So, yeah, but it's normal. Anywhere you go and anywhere you want to work.
Is the real name of the searcher?
Yes. He's he is Gary Captain in English. Yes, he is. He was never trained as an archaeologist formally, but he learned. And many of these early in 1960, no one knew how to do this work, so it didn't really matter. Right? He was, but he was from what became what became East Germany. But then he settled in Sicily, and so yes, that is his real name. And he passed away in 2011, 12. I can't remember. Just before our work started. So we never had the chance to compare results, but his notes he made available. There's some are in Palermo, some are in Oxford, and some are in Texas, the US. So yeah, you're very welcome. Great.
You have usual product
with the scans and all the stuff. I was wondering if they're wondering if you have also archaeometrical programs to pinpoint and to check all the networks and that's my question. Yeah. No, we do for the marble, it's easy. Because we have a database of stable isotopes we can compare everything to. So Scott Pike of Willamette University is the one doing this work. And we know some pieces actually come from Ephesus now, a few pieces, but it's unclear where they're from. This complicates our picture. So we're doing more and more to kind of identify of the marble through grain size, stable isotopes, petrography, and a combination of these things that something we don't need to test every object because some look so obviously clearly the same, but we're trying to identify now the things that look a little bit different. So yes, with ceramics, we know that our amphoras are of two fabrics. Our late Roman 2 amphoras are from two fabrics. Almost all of them come from the Southern Argolid. These we compared with the work of Mark Hammond at Missouri. Which are major. They have to be desalinated, conserved, and then they have to all be x-rayed, or we need CT scans of everything. So this we do with CNR and Catania through collaboration with them. And so we're finally getting scans of the last group, I think, this summer. So slowly. It will see publication soon. This will not be a 50-year project. I am determined. So, well, if you want to ask questions other than that, I'm happy to answer them on the side as well, but excellent.
To take care.
No, it's my thanks entirely. Right. Okay. Thanks. Good.
Remember that we have the next Tuesday, we have a focus on the
Yeah, you're very